So what is it we are in here for? It's not only because it's fun to be an activist, it's actually because that we have a lot of rights, political and social rights, who are violated, because poverty is a violation of human rights. Our mission is to train activists to fight poverty and to fight for human rights. In other words, if you are not neutral in this kind of situation where we find ourselves today, you are on the side of the oppressor. But to link up to you, Stephen, is to say, yeah, but what about how do we work with creative activism? And first of all, I would say we are also here to be inspired today and learn more. I mean, it's not every time you can say that we connect up with artists or how creative is it or whatever. But anyway, we use quite a lot of time, and I think where we actually over the year developed something where we are quite specialized in doing this kind of activism where you can like capture the whole history in one picture.
Stephen is normally, as I said, is an associate professor teaching in culture, communications, history and politics at New York University. And today I would like to highlight also your book, Dream, Reimagining Progressive Politics in an Age of Fantasy, if people are interested in reading more about that.
And actually, I want to start by thanking everybody for being here. This is amazing. But it's a real treat to actually speak to an audience like this, because the folks in this room, I imagine, are not just people who want to understand the world, but actually want to change the world as well. I've been an activist much longer than I've been an academic. I started when I was 17. I built houses in Nicaragua. I got arrested with ACT UP. I started a community organization called Lower East Side Collective. For the past few years, however, working with an artist named Steve Lambert, I've been training activists how to think a little bit more like artists, and artists how to think a little bit more like activists. Our major project is something called the School for Creative Activism, and you can see an image of it up there. And what we do is fairly simple, is we actually go around North America and we train grassroots organizers, people that have been in the field for quite a number of years, and we have great confidence that they know how to do organizing. And what we try to do is add something to their toolbox. Creative activism, in my opinion, should never be a replacement for the other types of organizing and activism that happen, but instead a tool that activists can actually draw upon that will make them more effective. We've been lucky enough to be funded by George Soros. I don't think he knows he's funding us, but in any case, by the Soros Foundation. And so we've been doing this for the past 3 years in North America, and this year we'll be going to Kenya to work with health activists, and in Russia as well. And so we're actually moving out of North America and moving other places as well. And what I want to talk about today is really the work that we do in this School for Creative Activism and why we do it and why we think it's important. So I want to start with an exercise. So for those of you that consider yourselves politically active, even those that don't, I want you to close your eyes for a second. I'm not from California. Just want to put that out. Okay, so it's not going to get touchy-feely, okay? But close your eyes for a second, and I want you to think back to the moment you became politicized. Go back there for a moment and relive it. Relive that moment. Think about what it felt like. Think about perhaps what it looked like. Maybe even smelled like. Okay. So who here remembered this moment as the time you were asked to sign a petition? Or the moment you were handed a flyer? Or the moment you read a white paper or report? Okay. So, who wants to be brave and will tell us about the moment that they were politicized?
When I went to the slums in Brazil.
Good. Okay. Talk to me a little bit about that.
I'm a Brazilian.
Okay.
And I lived always we went with the school for a little research, and it was really more amazing than I thought it would be.
What did it feel like? What did it look like?
It felt like I had no power at all, in a way, to change or to do something.
A sense of profound powerlessness.
Yes.
Yeah. What did the situation smell like?
Oh, it's awful.
Yeah. Human waste.
Pee.
Yeah.
I imagine the 1st of May, where everyone goes to the Fælledparken here, which is a big park in Copenhagen. And my parents used to take me there as a child.
Good. Okay. What was it like?
it was crowded, a lot of beer, a lot of music.
Yeah. And I think very importantly that your parents took you there. And this idea of, there we go, is that you know, this was something you did within this familiar structure of your family. Now, the point of this exercise is not, you know, if we went around the room, we would get 1,000 different stories. But I think what would bring all those stories together is that they were vivid experiences. They were emotional experiences. Seeing a protest and understanding that all of these people, including your parents, were there for a reason, and the reason was to change the world. These are the experiences that I think are at the basis of politicizing everybody. Yet, as political activists, what we often do is ask people to sign petitions. We ask people to read reports. We ask people to read our flyers and what have you. That is, we engage other people, trying to politicize them, make them activists themselves, make them support the cause, make them see the world differently, make them imagine a new future in the very ways which we didn't imagine a new future, imagine that things could be different, or disappointed by the past. We essentially expect them to become politicized in a way that we do not become politicized. So, here we are. These are activists, okay? This is us, okay? We've all been here. It's at the literature table, okay? You're at a rally, you're handing out pamphlets, and so on and so forth. And it's based upon a fundamental assumption. That is, we're taught that the truth will set us free. If only people had access to the right information or the right education, they would make the right decisions, okay? And of course, the right decisions are our decisions, okay? The decisions we would like them to make. But this is deep within the Northern activist psyche, okay? And it has its basis in sort of our conception of how democracy works. And this is how democracy has basically been theorized, okay? Here's a British coffee house of the 1700s, okay? And this is the model, sort of the classic public sphere in which democracy is born and where well-off, well-educated white men sat around reading newspapers and discussing politics, okay? And this is how democracy, even up to this point, theorizes itself. Yet this is how democracy is actually practiced, okay? It's not so much about facts and deliberation and reason as about story and spectacle and making emotional associations and connections. In 2007, this is the previous election, the last election, the Obama campaign ran an experiment with visitors to their website and discovered that more people responded favorably to pictures of Obama with his family than any other set of pictures. So that's why the first photograph tweeted after this election was Obama and his family, okay? And that's why all the stage performance for both elections is always Obama and his family. Because they understand that people aren't voting for their rational self-interest. They're not voting on their knowledge, necessarily, of the platform. That's not to say that they don't. But in addition, they're voting for his family. They're voting for Michelle Obama. So, the truth does not necessarily set us free, okay? Knowing is not enough. Politics is not just rational, but also an affective experience. And people need to see, feel, experience, and imagine what change would be like if they're going to join in. In brief, politics is much about culture as it is about ideas. Culture as a space to imagine change, and culture as creating the context to support that change. Creativity is also essential to good organizing. It enables activists to imagine new tactics, strategies, and goals to keep campaigns fresh and make them more effective. I like to think that the first time there was a mass march, it was amazing. And the second time, it was pretty amazing. And the 568th time we do it, not so amazing. My first movement job was actually organizing these big marches, okay? And I still do. But, for example, when the entry of the United States into the Iraq War, we put 2 million people out on the streets, and nothing changed. And in fact, public opinion in the United States did not change until about 2 years later, for all sorts of reasons. But one of the reasons was this very simple creative action when the mother of a dead soldier staged a dramatic encampment outside President Bush's vacation home. Because, as you were saying, within an image, it captured an entire reality. And that reality was about a president who was quite willing to send other people to die to a war which nobody knew what we were fighting for. Creativity also taps into an expertise that most people possess but don't think of applying to the serious business of politics. Even if most of us don't compose symphonies or paint majestic landscapes, we listen to music on our iPods, we perform songs in our churches, we upload videos we've made to YouTube, we assemble scrapbooks with friends, we watch TV and read books and talk to people about them. "I'm not political" is a phrase one hears often, but it's a rare person, however, that doesn't identify with some form of culture and creativity. And this gives an opening for those of us who are in the business of talking about politics. That is, culture lowers barriers to entry. As something which is already embraced, that is already familiar to most people, it has the capacity to act as an access point, which organizers can use to approach and engage people otherwise alienated from typical civic activity and community organization, okay? Let me put it a different way. One of the things, when I was working with Reclaim the Streets, sort of the idea of Reclaim the Streets, which came from London in the early 1990s, was to make demonstrations that people actually wanted to go to. And how do you make demonstrations people actually want to go to? You have a big kicking sound system. And with that big sound system, we brought in people that normally would have nothing to do with politics. Now there's a whole other problem of how do you keep people engaged and make it so people just don't come for the party and then leave afterwards, okay? But that's an organizing strategy, and that's something that we need to think about as organizers. But the fact is every march we had, we got the same usual suspects. But when we shifted the terrain to a cultural experience that people had in the rest of their lives, going to parties, okay, going out to clubs, all of a sudden we brought in a new bunch of people and made this scary thing, politics, into something familiar, which was a party. Indeed, I would argue that cultural creativity is exactly the possession of those people, young people, the poor, people of color, that are often most marginalized from more formal spheres of power, politics, laws, and education. That is, if you look at where cultural creativity comes from, it's often from those the most marginalized in a society. And if those are the people that we're trying to engage, we need to engage them on the places where they're the most powerful, where they have the most resources, where they have the most confidence, and they have the most skill. Because that is tapping into their strength as opposed to tapping into those spheres which they're ignorant of. So, the first rule of guerrilla warfare is to know your terrain and use it to your advantage. And the political landscape today is one of signs, symbols, stories, and spectacles, okay? So this is a graduating class. This was with Occupy Faith, which was the religious wing of Occupy Wall Street, who we did a retreat with. But what we've been doing since 2010, as I said before, is we've been training these grassroots activists how to navigate this cultural terrain. Now, very importantly, we did not invent the practice, okay? The merging of arts and activism and creativity has been around for millennia. So let's go back a couple. To Jesus of Nazareth, okay? And since I'm in Denmark, I figured I'd use the Lego version of the telling of the story, okay? Now, it's not Christ the divine figure I'm interested in here, but instead the purely historical Jesus, a radical Jewish Mediterranean peasant living 2 millennia ago, protesting a local religious elite and a foreign imperial power, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, Jesus was, above all, an activist and an organizer. You can see his organizing band right there. And judging by the 2,000-year duration of Christianity, he was pretty good at it, okay? One of the reasons why I would argue is that Jesus understood the fundamentals of using story and spectacle, signs and symbols, as a means to criticize the status quo, but also offer up an alternative version. So, when Jesus enters the main temple of Jerusalem and overturns the tables of the money changers and sellers of ritual objects, what he's doing is he's staging an effective political performance. He could have stood outside and harangued the passerby with his opinions, but instead what he did, instead of lecturing and berating people outside, he went into the space in which he wanted to affect and demonstrated his politics. With an act of civil disobedience. Now, in the United States, we interchange the word demonstration and protest all the time. I think it's a useful way of thinking about protest is also to think of them as demonstrations. They're demonstrating either one's rage against the powers that be and the status quo, or they're demonstrating the world that we'd like to bring into being. So what Jesus did is he demonstrated in a way, visually and bodily, his political ideals, and did it in such a provocative way that news of his deed and therefore his message traveled all through Jerusalem. You know, there's this guy in San Francisco who's a minister who has done the entire Old Testament and New Testament in Legos. I mean, I don't know what he does. But in any case, Jesus had a very interesting way of getting his message across. He didn't deliver laws, he told stories. Often stories which didn't make a lot of sense. Because really what he meant was to pose a question, a riddle, an unanswered question, of which the audience themselves had to answer. And you can almost imagine what the scene was like after one of these impromptu teachings. People walking away saying, what the hell was that guy talking about? But with every discussion, with every debate, the message became the people's and not Jesus's. There's a profound decentering of the storyteller and also an ownership of the message itself by the people. Final slide on Jesus. Sitting down to dinner, Passover dinner, was a deeply symbolic act in biblical times. Who you invited to your table and who you didn't invite to your table had everything to say about who you accepted into your family and into your idea of society. So when Jesus sits down with women, with tax collectors, with the ill, with children, he enacted in the here and now the egalitarian community here foretold for the future. In other words, he demonstrated through his actions this future of the world. So I'm going to skip ahead 1,500 years to the U.S. Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, 1960s. Everybody familiar with this image? Okay. This is Rosa Parks. It's one of the most iconic images of the U.S. Civil Rights struggle. Rosa Parks, arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama city bus, and thereby triggering a bus boycott, okay? One of the opening shots in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Now, as the story goes, Parks was an ordinary woman, tired from a long day at work, who simply reached that breaking point, which we can all reach, and refused to be treated as less than human. It was an act of spontaneous courage that inspired some, threatened others, and launched the Civil Rights Movement. It's a very nice story, and it was one propagated by the Civil Rights Movement itself. But it's just that. It's a story. As some of you might know, Rosa Parks wasn't just some person who got on a bus. She was an experienced organizer. She was the local secretary of the NAACP. She had been trained at the Highlander Center, which was a center for arts and activism. That is, she was a professional organizer who sat down knowing exactly what was going to happen and what the results would be. This is the larger uncropped photo of this, which sometimes you also see. This man, who do you think he is? Take a guess. Yeah.
A white man hired for the job so that she can sit right next to a white man on the bus.
Very close. I grew up thinking it was just some white Southerner, Southern bigot who, was angry at this uppity black woman. But you come much closer. He's not hired, but what he was a local AP reporter who happened to be there, and they said, look, we need a white person behind him. So he got in there, and they shot this photograph. This photograph was also staged. It didn't happen at the moment, it happened 3 days later. And so this iconic photo of the Civil Rights Movement was actually a staged photo. Now, this is what's important. That doesn't mean it wasn't real. Rosa Parks was tired, and she could not sit down in the front of the bus in the segregated South. But her act was a performance that dramatized the reality of racial inequality to a larger world that either didn't know or didn't care. Another series of civil rights photos. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference campaigned to desegregate Birmingham, Alabama. This was Martin Luther King's organization. So many of our images of the brutality of Southern racism and the Civil Rights Movement come from that demonstration. Here's a man being attacked by a police dog, school children being marched off to jail, and the very famous photos of the Birmingham Fire Department hosing down peaceful demonstrations. Now, what's interesting about this is that this was a performance as well. It was not just staged once, but staged twice. A year earlier, the SCLC did the exact same demonstration in a town in Georgia. But in the town in Georgia, the police, much smarter man than this person I'll talk about in a second, very peacefully and calmly arrested everybody, threw them in jail for a couple of days. And that was the end of it. So the SCLC learned. They went back, and when they planned the next year's campaign, they figured out their performance had to have an antagonist. And this is the man they chose. This is Bull Connor. Bull Connor was the police chief of Birmingham, Alabama. He was an out-and-out racist, part of the White Citizens Council, and he also just recently lost an election, and so he's a lame duck, and essentially had nothing to lose by unleashing the racist furor on these protesters. And the result was the images we know now. The images of black decency and courage and white violence and racism were broadcast around the world. It was a brilliant and creative act of strategic dramaturgy, as social movement historian Doug McAdam has called it. Again, it's not that this wasn't reality. It was reality, but it was staged reality. That is, it was a reality for black citizens in the South, happened every day when the sun went down and when the cameras weren't around, and that was a problem for the civil rights movement. What they understood is they had to move that reality into the day, and they had to move that reality into a time when there was actually cameras there, and then stage that racist brutality. 1 year after Birmingham, the Civil Rights Act was passed in the United States. Creative activism, I would argue, has been part of all successful activism. But in recent years, it's become a very self-conscious activity. So I'm going to put up some recent examples, and they really are a thoroughly incomplete and somewhat random sampling, okay? Some of these examples I'm going to show you are linked to campaigns. Some are just sort of one-offs done by people who probably identify themselves more as artists as activists. Some of these people we work with, some of these people we don't know. Most are from North America, but we could, going around this room, we could find just as many examples. So don't look at this as the quintessential, examples of creative activism. It's just some examples. One is a Texas water fountain by this woman, Lauren Butterfly Woods. There she is right there. And there's a courthouse in Texas, in Houston, Texas. No, I'm sorry, Dallas, Texas. And what had happened in this courtroom is a sign had fallen off the wall. And underneath the sign, barely able to see, was something that said whites only. And so what Lauren Butterfly Woods did is she created an art project whereby in order to get a drink, you had to wait 45 seconds and you were shown a video of some of the scenes from Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 before you got that drink of water, okay? And so essentially what you had to do, as opposed to sort of covering the poster up, what she did is you made people look at the racist history of the southern United States. This, of course, became a big conversation in Texas at that point. Here's one of the county commissioners, Mike Cantrell, said, "If somebody's interested and wants to see the history of all that, it's just fine. But to force people to wait 45 seconds to get a drink, you basically make that water fountain inoperable." To which another commissioner, John Wiley, responded, "I think it's okay to wait 45 seconds for water. Some of us have waited 45 years and longer." And the point is, this very simple act actually brought up and made people address the issues of racism and the continuing legacies of racism in the Deep South. Here's another. There's a transborder immigration project by Ricardo Dominguez with Bang Lab. And what it is a very simple project. It's a GPS tracking system, mapping system, on a very cheap cellular phone that's distributed over the border in Tijuana to help people that are crossing the border, migrants, immigrants crossing the border, to find things like water. Now, what makes this creative? It's actually quite useful, okay? But what makes this creative is that Ricardo, and that's him right here, who's good at staging a photo op, is an artist. And so not only, and as well as someone who works with technology, and so not only does this actually work as an object of utility, that is getting people over the border safely, but as you cross the border and at key points, poems pop up in Spanish. And so as you cross the border, you get a beautiful poem. As you find water, you get a beautiful poem. And it's the idea that what's a tragedy for many people, this having to cross a border, which is a very dangerous border and full of troubles, should also be a beautiful experience simultaneously. It also happens to be controversial enough, interesting enough to get written about. And he, of course, got written about in San Diego, used his art as a way to talk about larger issues of migration, immigration, safety, and what have you on the border. This is the Undocubus. This is very recent. And this is young people in the United States that do not have papers. They're, quote unquote, illegal aliens. And what they've done is they've gone on a bus tour of the Deep South in order to talk about the fact that they are, quote unquote, illegal, even though most of them were born in the United States. And they took as their symbol the monarch butterfly. And the monarch butterfly in North America migrates freely from Canada to Mexico and Mexico back to Canada. And so they use this symbol, this beautiful symbol, saying that everybody loves, and superimpose that on the image of the illegal alien. This idea that we're all migrants and that we are as beautiful as the butterfly itself. And it's a symbol that's become adaptable. Is when they did their marches, they would put on wings and sort of flutter down the street, which made people ask, what are these people doing? And immediately made people have an association between this beautiful thing, which everybody cherished, and these people which are often demonized in the United States. Some of you may have heard of Reverend Billy. He's probably been around here. He travels a lot in Europe. What Reverend Billy is he's a performance artist, okay? But he plays a reverend, and he plays one of those TV evangelical, beautiful hair and crazy accent, and he's got a choir and an quite excellent choir behind him as well. And he uses this pop cultural persona to make points about, here he's exercising the demons from Bank of America. But he uses this kind of cartoon-like character in order to talk about quite serious issues, things like predatory lending rates or copywriting of coffee beans, Ethiopian coffee beans by Starbucks, and so on. Again, trying to use a symbol that we're familiar with, makes us smile, we laugh about, in order to bring us to a terrain of the political nature which we might feel more uncomfortable with. Reverend Billy also has incredibly moving services, and his choir is actually quite good. And so it's very entertaining at the same time as it's politically edifying. This is the Yes Men, who actually came and worked with you guys in COP15. Some of you may have heard of the sort of most famous stunts. This was one of them. What they do, among other things, is they pretend to be people they aren't. In this case, they pretended to be spokespersons from Dow Chemical and were invited on the BBC to comment on the fact that Dow Chemical had just bought Union Carbide, and it was the 10th anniversary of the disaster in Bhopal. And so, seeing a good opportunity when it came, what Andy, right there, did is he showed up on television as Dow Chemical and said, we take full responsibility. That we are good corporate citizens, and good corporate citizens take responsibility for the actions of themselves and their subsidiaries. We made X amount of billion dollars in profits this year, and we plan on redistributing them amongst the people that we've harmed, okay? Immediately, Dow's stock dropped. And then, of course, it came out that this was a hoax. Now, what's interesting about it being a hoax, of course, is that then Dow Chemical had to go out in public and say, we have no intention of taking responsibility for what we have done, or what our subsidiaries have done, or what we do with our profits. And once that happened, the stock went back up, okay? Now, the story's not finished, because Dow Chemical never did that. The Yes Men did that as Dow Chemical. That is, Dow Chemical knew that what you do when you get pranked like this is you don't say anything. And so what the Yes Men did is they pretended, now they were Dow Chemical, outraged by what the Yes Men had done. And so on and so forth. And then, of course, the BBC had to bring them back on to talk about why they had pranked Dow Chemical, which gave them another platform to talk about what corporations should be doing and aren't doing, okay? And so this idea of very creative media jamming, which kept the story going, for what otherwise would have been, a little blip, this happened 10 years ago, to really an indictment of corporations and the projection of an image, the demonstration of an ideal of what a corporation could be and perhaps should be. The clandestine insurgent rebel clown army. This is something that actually starts in London, also came to America. This was created during all of the large demonstrations against, whether it be WTO, COP15, and so on, that happened in North America and in Europe, in which there was often a standoff between police and militant demonstrators. Now this makes for really good television, okay? It also makes for a very bad story for protesters. Because why do you need a heavy police presence? You need a heavy police presence because you have these militant, anarchist, black protesters, okay? And then it works the other way. Why do you need to be a militant, anarchist, black protester? Because you have these riot police. It's a coherent story which locks out most people, okay? I'm not them, I want nothing to do with this demonstration. And so what these folks did is they dressed up as militant clowns, okay? And essentially, stole the show, okay? Is that in one of these demonstrations, what they did is they defused the machismo, which often accompanies these demonstrations, and made the police, instead of look like they were protecting law and order, made them look absolutely ridiculous. There's nothing more ridiculous than clubbing a clown. Now, interestingly, this also has something to do with context, okay? This worked in Europe, it does not work in America. American cops do not care about clubbing a clown, okay? Essentially, when we did it in the United States, the police came up to us and said, you step off the sidewalk, all the clowns get arrested. And that was the end of it, okay? But in Europe, where you seem to have a more civilized police force, it tends to work a little better. I can't imagine that happening any place other than Britain. This idea of clowning actually travels well. And I don't know if you know the former mayor of Bogota, Columbus, Antanas Mockus, okay? He's a former philosophy professor who got elected as the mayor of Bogota and had very novel ideas about what to do. And one of the problems in South America and in New York, for all that matter, is nobody pays any attention to the traffic. Not only not paying any attention to the traffic laws, but there's actually a moment of pride, and I know this as a New Yorker, to be able to jaywalk, okay? And so rules didn't seem to stop anything. But this is a problem. It causes traffic jams. The cars go where they're not supposed to go. The pedestrians go where they're not supposed to go. So what he did is he hired mimes. And what mimes would do is they would ridicule pedestrians and ridicule drivers. And they found that actually using this ridicule was very effective at getting people to stop. Because it's one thing to be, I'm breaking the law, I'm sticking it to the man. It's the other thing to be, ridiculed by a mime as you're crossing the street, okay? This practice spread from Bogota and is now also used in Caracas, Venezuela as well. Okay, this is another example, the second to my last example here, of Iraq veterans against the war, Operation First Casualty. One of the things that happened to soldiers that were coming back from Iraq is that they noticed that while they were fighting a war 3,000 miles away, there was no evidence of that war in the United States at all. That is, and this is how modern warfare is fought, okay? It's fought far away, it's fought against people that one never sees, and it's fought usually by poor people. And so what these veterans did is they literally brought the war home. And they staged combat missions on the streets of New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles. And they had three basic scenarios. One was a standard sort of securing of an area. And these are professional soldiers, so they know how to do this. Another was bagging of suspects. And another one was taking sniper fire and taking one of the wounded comrades out. And I watched them do this, and it's absolutely chilling. Because even though they only have their hands like this, you can imagine the gun in their hands. And they are so pumped up with adrenaline and anger and swearing at people, and the fear that they experienced in Iraq translates to the city streets. And all of a sudden, you're aware of what war feels like. If only as a performance, if only for a moment. The horror of an occupation. And that's what they wanted to do. Now, they couldn't do it very long because they themselves started basically having flashbacks about what it was like to fight in Iraq. But for the time being, it was a very, very effective at bringing the horrors of war and the horrors of occupation back to these home countries which blithely send their soldiers out to do these sorts of things. The last example comes out of Occupy Wall Street. After Occupy Wall Street shut down, all those people had to go someplace and had to bring the sort of some of the creative actions which they did in Occupy Wall Street. And so one group, Occupy the Banks, brought theirs to the streets of New York City. And I just could show a little video clip.
We need a home of our own. Bankers keep taking our homes, but we won't let them go. We need a home of our own. We gotta take back something we own. Okay. We need a home of our own. Bankers keep taking our homes, but we won't let them go. We need a home of our own.
This is awesome. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, so nice and cozy. Hey, no, it's like, just rent your place out.
You're renting a place out?
$230 million.
Because Bank of America took our home, so we thought we'd move in here.
Yeah, just $230 million.
Hey! I love the new place. This is so awesome. I brought your place too. Yeah, here I only have one left. It's got house. In the middle of the bank, our house. In the middle of the bank, our house. In the middle of the bank, our house. In the middle of the bank.
What I've shown you so far is basically tactics, okay? Tactics which are linked into larger campaigns, but essentially things which will draw, ideally, an outsider in, make activism perhaps more approachable, more funny, what have you, but they basically are on a tactical level. And this is one of the things that creative activism does. But one of the things that we try to do at the School for Creative Activism is think not just creatively about tactics, that is, having a more spectacular demonstration or producing a better looking poster or telling a better story, although all of this is important, but also how to speak in a cultural language to map an entire campaign, okay? That is, we teach people how to map their cultural terrain in order to create the campaigns that speak within the culture that already exists. And we teach people how to move past this common culture and to imagine their own ideas, that is, their own utopias, and then build a campaign that reflects this. And I just want to briefly go through these. The first is this idea of speaking within a language, a cultural language, which people already understand. In order to reach people, we need to use a language they understand. Words, symbols, signs that they embrace, that are familiar to them, particularly when introducing unfamiliar political concepts. So I'm going to make a quick return to biblical times, to Apostle Paul, okay, who was basically the crackerjack organizer of the Christian church. I feel very ambivalent about Paul, okay? On the one hand, I abhor him because he's an opportunist. On the other hand, I love him because he's an opportunist, okay? And here's one of his statements. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To the weak I become weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. Creepy? Inspiring? A little bit of both. But he was a good organizer. Now, a large majority of people in my country, anywhere from 76 to 83%, identify themselves as Christians. That doesn't mean they were born as Christians. It means they self-identify as Christians. An additional 4% identify as Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, or Hindu. Only 15% claim that they're not religious at all. And regardless of religion's belief, many of the guiding myths, symbols, and ideals of the United States have their roots in the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. So whether we like it or not, religion forms the contours of a majority of people's lives and consciousness. It is if not the lingua franca that people use to imagine how life could and should be different from advanced capitalism. So what do we do with that? What I would say is to be an effective activist, one needs to be able to learn how to speak this language. One needs to be able to talk in a language that people understand, even if one doesn't want to embrace it themselves. That doesn't mean necessarily that you have to have the same outcome. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have the same message, but you do have to be able to talk in a language that people understand, or otherwise you're rendered mute. Now, what this means is not just that, one should adopt a religious language, because religion isn't the only socializer in this world. The other prime socializer in our society today is the mass commercial culture itself, Kanye West and Kim Kardashian. Okay? To be an effective activist, you need to be able to talk the talk, even if you are uneasy walking the walk. And in today's world, that means asking yourself, as a creative activist, what would Jesus do? Or what would Moses do? Or what would Muhammad do? Or what would Buddha do? Or what would Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva do? Or perhaps even what Kim and Kanye would do. That is, let's go back to know your terrain and use it to your advantage. The point here is not to embrace popular culture or religious culture uncritically, but to understand it and use it to your advantage. That is, channel the needs that it meets and the dreams it articulates into the work that we do. One of the things we do in our trainings is on Saturday night, we have a cultural event. When we were stuck out in the woods with these Occupy Faith folks, we knew we couldn't go anyplace, so we brought Monopoly games and made all of these priests and nuns and rabbis and imams play Monopoly. And they are vicious motherfuckers, I'll tell you that, okay? And then what we do is we talk the next morning about what is it in these popular games, in this popular culture, that makes it popular? And what can we do to speak to some of those people's needs? The idea is not to make a Monopoly game of activism or make a spectacular movie of activism. That's the easy stuff. Let's wear tights for our next demonstration. That's not what it's about. It's understanding the DNA, the core of the popular culture in which we live, in order to be able to speak to those desires, those needs, those fears. Does that make sense? Okay. Once we know the terrain and understand its aesthetic language, we don't have to be limited by its borders and the path where it leads us, okay? Which often lead into religious quietude or consumer dissatisfaction. So another important aspect of the work we do is working with activists to use creativity to imagine their new goals or their own utopia. So here's another exercise, okay? Close your eyes for a second. And imagine winning. What does a win look like? Okay. Don't be shy. Yeah.
Okay. I was in Liberia.
Yeah.
Last month. Started some work with art on the streets there, and we found that very difficult because it's kind of a locked up system.
Mm-hmm.
So I just imagined that that we can make it happen.
Okay. Good. What does making it happen look like? What is it? What do you mean?
That we can find support for this project, not only from home, but in the culture, and that's what I wanted to ask you about.
What is the project you want to have support both here and there?
Oh, it's about, Liberia is kind of fucked up from the war, and, there's no art scene there, and we're working on, trying to help the young artists evolve.
Good. Stay there for a second.
Okay.
You won that. They've accepted you in Liberia. You're getting funding from back here. These young people have the luxury, mental, physical, what have you, to do the sort of creative work that you think that they're capable of. Then what happens?
I think art has this humanitarian value in when art on the street can speak like from the people to the people, and it's something else that art in the galleries and the museums, and it's kind of if they see something else in UN cars and American billboards and mining companies, I think it can help them get up in the morning and think about something else than just getting water and food.
Good. So what are they thinking about besides water and food?
Speak out,
And what are they speaking out about?
They're not, and that's the problem. But
No, but you won all this. That is you keep winning, okay? Now you have young people on the streets in Liberia producing art. And it's art that isn't just about the images they see on the television, images something else, but they're producing art which expresses something else. What is it they're expressing?
Expressing, you know, like we are doing it here, is like when we express more freely in our part of the world with art, you know. But it's not. It's more like for fun. But I see it in this context. I see it. I mean, for fun in a way, but you know what I mean. But for them, I think it has a basic value of you know, feeling free. People start speaking out, and it's a kind of common understanding.
In order to get to this place where people are speaking out, they're communicating freely, so you've conjured up this idea of a community, you've conjured up this idea of a participation in a community where anybody can say what they like, and that what they like is not bound by their poverty, is not bound by the popular culture which surrounds them, that is, they're free to imagine a utopia, if you will. And as we get closer and closer to what this wind really looks like, it starts to take this sort of imaginative space where one can imagine what the world would be like if we won everything we're looking for. You got involved in what you're doing because you have this vision of what a world would be like when all of these things that you're working on actually happen. This is absolutely critical to sort of creative thinking about goals, okay? That is, people want to dream. It's what gets us up in the morning and moves us through our lives. But we often get stuck as organizers on these small little steps that will get us there. It's not to say that those steps aren't important, they're critically important, but we have to be able to articulate where we're going if we're going to actually get anybody to follow us. Articulating these dreams enables us to tap into the dreams that motivates us all, moving us away from the negative, no, we don't want that, and instead towards what we do want, okay? Because when we say no, it essentially reinforces the power we're working against. It gives that power back to the people that we're resisting. It's a parasitical relationship of resistance. But when we say yes, when we move out of that terrain to this terrain of our own making, we're never going to reach this utopian place. Maybe you will, but most likely you won't. And besides, utopia itself, as most of you know, is created from the Greek words eu and topos, which mean not place. This is what Thomas More was playing with, okay? But what it does give us is a North Star to guide us. And then images of utopia also help us work backwards and think about our tactics as a string of actions that lead someplace and, importantly, all contain a kernel of the final ideal within themselves. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, that is that we think of tactics often as, well, we've got to do this demonstration, we've got to do that, but each one has to have a little kernel of a world that we're going to have, so each one can build upon each other, and so that there's a logical coherence, a story being told, and a path we lead people on. This is what advertisers do with teaser campaigns and with branding, and essentially we should be learning from them, again, and doing it ethically. Now, there's a lot of stuff that we do with creative activism, which we're not going to talk about, okay? We do stuff on aesthetic theory, we do stuff on cognitive theory, we do stuff in social marketing theory. This is a creative mapping exercise where we basically start out where we are, okay? Demonization of abortion, we want to move to a place where we want to be. Birth control is free, love, happiness, and so on and so forth. This is a very ridiculous one, but we have organizers actually map this out on paper. And then we ask them to do 3 paths. And the first path is what they know how to do as organizers, which is, what's your business as usual? Your bread and butter organizing the stuff that you fall out of bed knowing to do. You talk to your executive director and they say, yeah, good idea, good campaign. In this case, you hold a demonstration. When all else fails, hold a demonstration, okay? Nothing wrong with it, okay? But it's business as usual. But then we ask people to imagine the absurd, imagine the impossible, okay? Where no laws of gravity, physics, money, what have you, time apply, okay? And in this case, we have a fairy godmother who just brings everything into being, okay? Now, very interestingly, when we were in Texas, working with this group doing tax justice work in Texas, in Austin, Texas, there were 2 nuns that were involved. And their crazy idea was to have the resurrection of Jesus. And that basically Jesus would, create a fair budget for everybody, okay? Now this has particular resonance in the South, of course, where all of these conservatives are always quoting the Bible, okay? But it's ridiculous. I mean, maybe it's not, but in any case, it's ridiculous. Jesus is not going to come, and he's not coming to Texas, okay? That's for sure, okay? So then what we ask people to do is chart a third path, okay? Which is in the middle, which is how do you make the impossible possible? How do you make the impractical practical? Or what we like to say, pragmatic utopianism, okay? So what did these nuns do? What they did is they came up with an idea. This is the Southwest of America, okay? The United States, where there's a large Latino population. In fact, these nuns were Latina. And they said, well, we're gonna find a guy named Jesus to run for governor, okay? Because the gubernatorial race was coming up. And Jesus would just, be Jesus, okay? And they might give him sort of a loose white shirt and ask him to grow a little beard, okay? And then he would enter into the debates, okay? And he would always start, every time he made a point, well, as Jesus, I would do this, okay? And he would give a moral argument for a more equitable distribution of tax dollars. And then you would have these conservatives having to argue against Jesus. So in any case, but it's ridiculous. I don't know if they ever did anything with it, but what's wonderful is they couldn't have imagined that until they imagined the impossible, okay? And the other exercise we do is we ask people to come up with ideas to move from A to B, for campaign ideas, come up with 2 ideas that are gonna work and 3 ideas that aren't gonna work. When people do that, then we say, go back to your 3 ideas that aren't going to work and make them work. And what that does is it allows people to free themselves from the tyranny of the possible and imagine what could be impossible and then backtrack into it. Some of the things you can never make work, okay? But it's in that sort of creative moment of freeing one's mind of the possible that we come up with new ideas which just might be doable. In any case, we do a lot more. And it takes 3.5 days, and I've probably gone on too long. So I'm going to end it right here. And again, thank you for coming out, and I look forward to your questions.
I'm a bit uneasy about making a culture of activism where you join in for the fun of it or for being a part of the group instead of really considering what is this, because then it becomes a race to make the best sort of event instead of actually educating people.
I think the struggle is to figure out how to take a culture in which we essentially interact with it as spectators and move it into a place where we actually interact with it as actors. And I actually think one can do that, but it's difficult because the culture that we are familiar with is essentially a spectacular culture. It's a consumer culture. But that is what people understand. And what we need to do is move the point, okay? That is, once people will talk to us, once people are willing to listen to us, then we can actually move people someplace else.
Just to follow up on what you just said. So, what's your criteria for success? If you, for example, take the Yes Man, and they're the place with both on dark chemicals, and you said it's not enough just to raise awareness. So was that successful or not successful? Why not?
I think the interesting question about creative activism is not only, and this is the troubling aspect of it for me, is not only in the purely short instrumental successes, like did we get this law stopped? Did we get this politician elected? Those are things which are on relative short terms, and you can say, yes, we did, and we think this was an integral part of the campaign. That is, did we raise awareness and turn the tide on public perception of the war in Iraq? One could say there was a series of actions which got a wide play in the media, which combined with other things that were happening in the culture probably did change the tide of public opinion about the war in Iraq. That's easy. What's much harder is if we're going to take creative activism seriously and understand it as an artistic practice, art doesn't always work in the purely instrumental register. It's really about fundamentally changing the very way that we understand the world, including what politics is itself.
I'm an engineer. I just came from a job interview and I talked about my activistic work. And you would just see the guy in the production at Novo Nordisk just going, maybe she's not the one leading my part of the production. I'm often encountering this schism between being a production engineer and an activist. Why does there need to be this contradiction between that? I don't get that.
Part of what tapping into activists' creative lives does is it makes them whole people, and so they don't separate out what they like to do at night from the dreary work that they have to do in the daytime. And one of the things that comes out of all the people that we work with is they say, you know, when we do this, it's actually, I enjoy it. It's fun. It taps into creative talents that I've otherwise segregated from the serious work of politics. And the irony is, I think, is that this is part of the serious work of politics when we're operating on a cultural topography, which is what we do. But it makes for a whole person, which is very threatening to activists, by the way. Part of our identity is we suffer. We're serious. We're better than other people. And I think we have to let go of that because I think we're going to lose.
If you'd been in charge of the Occupy Wall Street movement, what things would you have done differently to be more effective?
I thought at the time, like a lot of professional organizers, God damn it, why don't they shut this thing down and so we can actually take all those people that are really jazzed up and being organizers and get them into the serious business of doing politics. Now, for me, the serious business of doing politics includes staging ridiculous things in banks, okay? So I have a lot of leeway there. But for me, it was like, look at this spectacular demonstration, but where is it going to go, okay? No demands, no real challenges, looks more like a carnival than politics, as not only I recognize it, but power recognizes it. But now I'm starting to realize that you need a moment in order to develop a different language of politics, a different set of symbols of politics, a different set of practices of politics. Earlier, I talked a little bit about some of the features of Occupy which seem to make no sense from a political standpoint. You know, the classic one would be the General Assembly. They're horrible. Nothing gets done, okay? They're horrible, except that they work as a model for what a different political system could be like, a horizontal democracy. Does it work? No. Does it set the agenda for what we should be working on? Yes. And so I think they did okay for what it was. Besides, they wouldn't have listened anyway.
I think it's also important just to say any way of doing alternative ways of showing critique is actually creative activism. Mm-hmm. And just to emphasize that a lot of the pictures is more fun, mm-hmm. and that doesn't work always.
Right. What works in one context is not going to work anyplace else. And until you understand what the local culture is and what local cultural expression, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, it's not going to work. You can export a technique of creative activism. You can't export any of those examples. What I do have, and I encourage all of you to go to, is we have a user-created database of creative activism called actipedia.org. You go on it, you click create a page, and you get a template, you load up a picture, you give a description. We don't pay any attention to copyright, so you can just rip the description from any place you want. Most of them are in English, some are in Spanish, and I hope after tonight some will be in Danish as well, okay? Because the idea here is to create a global vocabulary. Not so we borrow the idea, but we get inspired by the practice. As I said, clowns don't work in New York at all. It just does not work.
I'm wondering how you've been perceived by the more traditional art scene. Is there a dialogue? Is there a critique, or how is it perceived?
Essentially, the art world has their idea of what socially engaged art is, but it has no interest in the efficacy question, to go back to this. Its only efficacy is insofar as it works as a piece of art, and they're not interested in it as it works as a piece of politics. And all of these folks that we put up here are interested in both simultaneously. I think the worst sorts of political art are what Walter Benjamin, in one of his famous essays, talked about: the aestheticization of poverty, or the aestheticization of politics, which is art about politics, or art about poor people, which in fact turns them from political agents into objects of contemplation, which is the worst thing, politically, in my mind, that one can do. Well, thank you very much. And I will make one final pitch for actopedia.org, as you think it would be spelled, Actopedia. And just post. Go home tonight. Post stuff up, okay? And yeah, because the more we learn from each other, the more creative and more effective we'll be.